All right. Hello and welcome here to our session number 4 as we are looking at, particularly that right now, the 12 steps of sermon preparation that I use. And again, just by way of a reminder, my book entitled Text Driven Preaching, co-edited with Danny Akin, that book has a chapter that I wrote in there called How to Prepare a Text-Driven Sermon. And my 12 steps are listed there, a little bit more detail. And I would encourage you to take a look at that, to follow along or to get a deeper understanding of how to write a good, solid text-driven sermon, a good, solid expository sermon. And this is what we've been doing is we're walking through the 12-step method. And so what I want to do is share my screen with you, and I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint that we have been using. And what I'm going to do is get us over to where we need to be in terms of how far we've gotten. We're in step number 5 right here, the step that says interpretation. We're in step number 5, and we've already looked at 6 of these. And just by way of quick review, remember I taught you to begin at the paragraph level, move to the sentence level, then the clause level. And so these are the first 5 steps that we have already talked about. We talked about these in our last session. So just by way of brief review there, you want to look at your boundary of your text. What's its genre? Identify the sentences, identify the clauses as independent and subordinate, and identify the verbs, and then the verbals, which means participles and infinitives. Now we're using Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2 as our guinea pig text for the talking about the principles of sermon prep. So keep that in mind. So really where we are then is right here. We're going to go to step number 6. And we talk about parsing all of the verbs. So let me go to where I can get it easily readable for everybody. So this is where we left off in our last session. You want to take all the verbs in your text after you've identified them, you've made a list of them, and then you want to parse them. In other words, what are their tense, voice, and mood? Is it a present tense verb? Is it a past tense verb? Is it a future tense verb? Is it a perfect tense verb? In other words, you want to make sure that you identify the parsings of the verbs there. What is their tense? Is it active or passive, or in terms of voice? Is it an indicative, a direct statement? In other words, what is its mood? Is it indicative or is it an imperative? These are the kinds of things you need to know about the verbs of your text in order to properly interpret your text, because the verbs are the load-bearing walls of the text, crucial to what you're doing. And so you want to keep that in mind as well. So number 6 is you want to parse all of the verbs. Now, number 7, identify the basic dictionary definition of any word that you're unfamiliar with. If you're in a text and you see a word, the English translation, obviously, you see a word there and you're not familiar with that word, you want to immediately identify its basic dictionary definition. For example, say you're preaching through 1 John and you're in chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. And you read there that, if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous, and he is the propitiation for our sins. And not for ours only, but also for the sins of the whole world. All right? If you are unfamiliar with that word propitiation, then you want to look that word up in a basic English dictionary and identify its meaning before you go further. Now, later, you'll do a full word study of that word probably, because that's a very important word for atonement in the New Testament. But right now, you just simply want to make sure you understand the word. So you want to identify the basic dictionary definitions of any unknown word. Just a simple step, but an important step. That's step number 7. Now, you're ready to go to step number 8. Determine the grammatical relationships of the clauses to one another. All right. In other words, what clauses modify what other clauses or sentences? And so what we want to do here is think about our text again, Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. And in fact, let me see if I can I'm going to go backwards here to the text a minute. There we go. And so look at our text again. Well, how did I miss that? There it is. Okay, so here's our text. Now, we've already identified those clauses, but let's look at them again. I have underlined all of the participles and the main verbs. So now let's ask ourselves, what modifies what? All right, so here is the first participle. Since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us. All right, now that's a participial clause. So now the question is, what does that clause modify? And in the text, that clause, a subordinate clause, modifies the main verb. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. So you read it like this. Since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us and laying aside every encumbrance, let us run. In other words, the since we have modifies the main clause there. That's the point. That's what I want you to see. And so this is what you do with every clause in your text. What modifies what? Because that's going to be crucial to an understanding of the structure of the text. So this clause right here, since we have, modifies let us run. All right, now let's look at the second clause. Laying aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. All right, that clause is also a subordinate clause. Therefore, by definition, it has to modify something. What does that clause modify? Well, it too is modifying the main verb. Let us run with endurance. In fact, notice it's telling you how to run or what to do as you run. Let us run, laying aside every encumbrance and the sin that easily entangles us. So this clause is a subordinate clause, and it too modifies the main verb, let us run. Then that leads us to the main clause, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. That is an independent clause. It's not modifying any other clause because it's the main clause in our text. Therefore, we make a note of that. We identify that is our main clause. All right, having done that, now let's go to verse 2. Fixing our eyes on Jesus. All right, that is also a participial clause. Therefore, it is a subordinate clause. So the question is, what does this clause modify? And the answer is the main verb and the main clause, the independent clause, let us run. That's what it modifies. How should we run? We run keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, who is the author and perfecter of the faith. So now what do we have? We have 3 clauses, all participial clauses, and they're modifying what? The main verb in the sentence. The main independent clause, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Right? Then you have one final clause in verse 2. It's a relative clause introduced by who? Who for the joy set before him. Now that too is a dependent clause. It cannot stand alone. So the question is, what is this clause modifying? And the answer is the who is telling us more about Jesus. Therefore, this clause also is modifying the previous clause, specifically the noun Jesus. Jesus is the one who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, etc. So the point of this step is, let me get back now where we are. The point of this step, go back to number 6 right there, is you want to parse all the verbs, and then you want to identify basic dictionary definitions. Here we are, number 8. The point of this step is to determine the relationships of the clauses to one another. And so you make notes on that, because that tells you that this sub-step right here in the big picture of exegesis, determining what clauses modify what, is crucial to the meaning of, to identifying the meaning of your text. In fact, unless you do this, you can't identify the meaning of your text. You either have to do this on paper or in your brain, just, as you work through it, see it in your mind, one of the two, but you have to determine what modifies what. This step is so very important to help you see the structure of your text. All right? So sub-step number 8 here, determine the grammatical relationships of the clauses to one another. All right, now then you're ready to say, okay, well, how do the sentences relate to one another then? Which convey main, primary information, which convey secondary information. All right, now remember that we said Hebrews 12, 1 and 2 is a single sentence in the Greek New Testament. Sometimes it's rendered as 2 sentences in an English translation, but it's actually one sentence. And then verse 3 is sentence number 2 in your paragraph. Remember that verse 3 says, "For consider him who endured such hostility against sinners, against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." So there's your second sentence in your paragraph. So now the question is, how does verse 3, which is a sentence, relate to verses 1 and 2, which is a sentence? And notice that the very first word in verse 3 is a subordinating conjunction for. So verse 3 is introduced, which is a sentence number 2, verse 3, is introduced grammatically subordinate to 1 and 2. So you just identify which sentences relate. How do the sentences relate? Verse 3 is subordinate to verse 2. Verses 1 and 2 give you the main point. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Verse 3 tells you the ground or the reason why you should do that. Consider him so that you won't grow weary and lose heart. That's the structure of those 3 verses. So step number 9, you want to identify how these sentences relate to one another. All right? And then number 10, determine how the paragraphs relate to the preceding and following paragraphs. All right? Now look at your paragraph, Hebrews 12, 1 through 3. How does that paragraph relate to the previous paragraph that ends chapter 11? Notice your paragraph, Hebrews 12, 1 through 3, begins with the word therefore. So there is a direct connection. Because of something in Hebrews 11, therefore do this in 12, 1 through 3. That's how your paragraph relates to the preceding paragraph, right? And so you make that connection. You get that connection in your mind, and you're going to bring that out in your preaching. You're going to explain how it is that the great Hall of Fame of faith of Hebrews chapter 11, those men and women of faith, how it is that they are the cloud of witnesses surrounding us. They've run their race. They've stayed true to Jesus. They have endured, and so should we. So we stand on their shoulders. That's why there is the word therefore that begins chapter 12, verse 1. That's the connection of this paragraph to the preceding paragraph, right? And you do the same with the following paragraph. Look at the connection there. But that's less important because that's the next paragraph you would preach on if you were preaching a series of sermons through Hebrews. To preach Hebrews 12, 1 through 3, well, you would really want to make sure you know how is that your paragraph connected with the immediately preceding paragraph. That's what step number 10 is about. All right, and then there's one final sub-step at this point, and that is, and by the way, it's optional. You can do this if you want, but you don't have to. You can diagram the paragraph. Now, remember in school we learned how to do syntactical diagramming. Most of us hated it when the English teacher taught us how to do this. That's line diagramming. You can do that, But I find for preaching more helpful to do block diagramming. Now, I want to show you what that looks like on your text. If you're not familiar with block diagramming, here is a block diagram of Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. The purpose of a block diagram, notice first that it's not a line diagram. You don't have the lines, the line here and then lines coming down underneath for adjectives and for subordinate clauses and things like that. No, in a block diagram, you arrange it by indentation showing what modifies what. So let me explain this diagram you're looking at. Notice what's at the far left side of the screen. That's where you put the independent clauses or independent sentences or the mainline information. We've already discovered in our text, therefore let us run with endurance the race set before us. That's the main information in our text. That's the only independent clause in our text. Everything else is dependent. So notice in the block diagram, this is placed as far left as we can get it to indicate that it is the most dominant information. It's your independent clause. Now notice right here, these three participial phrases all modify the main verb. They all modify the independent clause, let us run with endurance the race set before us. And they basically tell us how to do it. So notice these are indented underneath what they modify. All three of these clauses modify the same sentence. Let us run with endurance the race set before us. How? Having a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, laying aside every weight, looking unto Jesus. So notice each one of these is indented to show that they modify this right here. Now, notice this clause right here, looking unto Jesus. Looking unto Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him did this, that, and this, right? This is your relative clause. What is it modifying? It's modifying Jesus. Sorry, hit the wrong button there. Notice that everything right here in this section is telling you more information about who Jesus is. Do you see that? So this is further indented to the right to show that it is modifying that clause right there. And specifically, it's modifying the name Jesus. Looking unto Jesus, who is the one for the joy set before him, endured the cross, etc., etc. So here is then your outline structure of Hebrews 12, 1 and 2 in a block diagram. Now, I find this kind of diagramming very helpful for sermon preparation. Because now just think for a minute. Look at that on the screen right there. Think for a minute. What you have right there is the basic structure of the text. And therefore, for those of us who are going to do expository preaching, or what I'm calling text-driven preaching, guess what? What you have there is also the outline for your sermon. Here is your sermon outline taken directly from the text. In your sermon outline on this text, how many main points are there? 1. And there it is. 1 main point. How many subpoints are there? 3. And there they are. All 3 modifying that main point. And then is there another subpoint under anything? Yes, there's 1 subpoint here, modifying looking unto Jesus. And bingo, there's the structure of your text and the outline for your sermon. Now, you don't have to try to find an outline. The text itself gives you the outline. See, here's your main point, therefore run. Here are 3 ways to do it, all indicated by three parallel participles in the Greek text. And then you are to look unto Jesus. Now, why should I look to Jesus? What's so special about Jesus? Well, the author anticipates that, and so he says, because he's the one who endured the cross, scorning the shame, and now at the right hand of the throne of God has taken his seat. That's why you should look to Jesus. There's your reason for looking unto Jesus. So, this block diagramming, if you can just train yourself to do this kind of diagramming, it'll help you to see the structure of your text. Remember, the key to this is indenting. You start with a main clause, it goes far left. Then everything that modifies that clause, you indent. And then anything else modifying anything in those clauses, you further indent to the right. And that way you create a block diagram which shows you visually, allows you to see on the page visually the structure of your text. That then becomes the foundation when you get ready to write your sermon outline. There you're going to develop your sermon outline from right here. We'll talk more about that later, but that's what you're doing. I see a question.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
If, and I'm going to have to make something up here with just the example you've got. Say you had a subordinate here that modified having so great a cloud of witnesses.
Right.
You would indent that in between having and laying aside?
That is correct. Anything and everything in your text that would be modifying having so great a cloud of witnesses, that would be indented further to the right underneath it to show that it goes with that. That's correct. Anything, and you could have one clause or 10. It just depends on what the author is saying. But that is correct. That would be indented under this. Another right over here would be indented, and it would come there. And then the laying aside would come back and be parallel with having. That's correct. Because that, in other words, no matter how large of a text you've got, your block diagram can expand to include what modifies what. That's correct. And this is everything in the text of 1 and 2. Here's everything's there. And so it actually lays out like this in this text. But if the author had said more, like you were saying, if the author had said, having a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, and, these cloud of witnesses were X, Y, and Z, all right, then all of that, X, Y, and Z, would be indented under this because it would be modifying that. So that is correct. Is that helpful to make sure we're clear on how that works? So any text, you can do this block diagram with any text of Scripture. This kind of diagramming works really well with the letters of the New Testament, everything from Romans to Jude. Narratives are a little bit more difficult. You can still do this with a narrative, but this is especially helpful with all of the letters of the New Testament, Romans through Jude. So, this is an important step, block diagramming. If you can learn how to do this, you'll save yourself a lot of time. And what happens, let me show you the reason, another thing about this. Right there, just looking at that, notice how there is clarity regarding the structure of your text now. Looking at it in a Bible, or if you've got a digital text, you're reading the text, looking at it on your screen, on your computer or whatever, you don't see this as clearly. But when you take the time to lay out these things, notice now how clear the structure of this text becomes. Notice how clear what modifies "let us run with endurance the race set before us" now shows up. You see, it's really clear now because by virtue of indenting, you're showing what's the main stuff here and what's the subordinate stuff. And these are the things, this is how the author has encoded the meaning in his text. The author of Hebrews wants you to see he's got one main driving point. You need to endure in the Christian life. He's used the metaphor of the race to explain that. Run with endurance the race set before us. That's what he wants you to walk away with. There's the imperative, single imperative, main point right there. But he says, I want to tell you some things about how to do that. And so one thing I want you to know is you've got a cloud of witnesses surrounding you. Another thing I want you to know is you got to lay aside every weight in order to run. Another thing I want you to know is you got to look unto Jesus in order to run well. And another thing I want you to know about who Jesus is. I'd like for you to know some things about who Jesus is. So here I'm telling you what that is, the author is saying to us. So by doing this, by creating a block diagram of your paragraph that you're preaching from, this helps you to see how the text is put together. And this then helps you to put together a genuine expository sermon, true to the text. Now, you see, by doing this, for example, you realize that this participle right here, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, now that's not the most important information in the text. It is important, but it's not the most important. What's the most dominant information? What's the most important information in this text? It's the main clause. Therefore, let us run with endurance the race set before us. How do you know that's the most important information in your text? Because the author has made it the only independent clause. Everything else is dependent, which is his way of saying this independent clause is my most important point. These dependent clauses are my secondary points, further explaining my main point. Now, watch this. Therefore, if you were to preach your sermon on Sunday on this text, and you make your main point this looking unto Jesus clause right there, right? You make that the big deal. We need to keep our eyes on Jesus. Jesus is most important. We need to look to Jesus. Now, is that true? Absolutely, it's true. But watch what you just did. Is that looking unto Jesus, is that participle, which is a dependent clause, is that the most important information the author is conveying? And the answer is no. The author has already told you, by virtue of his independent clause and his imperative, run with endurance the race set before us. That is the most important information. And everything else here, all this stuff here, modifies that main clause. And, oops, sorry about that. Let's see which way. Here we go again. So that's this step of block diagramming will help you to preach the text correctly according to its structure, not superimposing an outline that doesn't match with the text. That's why what we're talking about here and this step, these several steps leading up to this, that's why this is important. Because what it does, it allows you to see, finally to see the big picture. There's the big picture structure of your text. And from this, you're going to determine the outline of your sermon when the time comes. All right. Any other questions about that before we move to the next level here? All right. Well, so now notice we've been looking at the paragraph level and we have been looking at the clause level, right? So now you're ready to move to the phrase level of your analysis of your text, because you have some phrases here in your text. So what you want to do is be sure to identify the phrases in your paragraph. And this would be true of especially the prepositional phrases. So you want to make sure you identify them. Determine the proper syntax and the proper translation of those phrases. You want to take the time to make sure you understand the phrases, right? So here we go. Analyze key phrases. Here are 3 examples of key phrases in our text. Cloud of witnesses, with endurance, and for the joy set before him. So we identify these phrases. Cloud of witnesses, with endurance, for the joy set before him. Now, what do those phrases mean? We've got to make sure we identify their meaning and their translation. So take this genitive phrase. In Greek, it's a genitive. If you've not had Greek, don't worry about it. Just we're talking about the use of here. Cloud of witnesses. What does that mean? Think about that for a moment. What is the interpretation of cloud of witnesses? That's a good translation. That's exactly what the Greek says, a cloud of witnesses. But you see, my question is this. What is the function of the word of there? Sorry, I hit that too much. What is the function of the word of in the phrase? A cloud of witnesses. Well, here the function of the meaning of the word of is like an equal sign. Because the author is saying that the cloud, that is the witnesses. The witnesses are like a cloud. In other words, the author is using a metaphor, the metaphor of the cloud in the sky, a metaphor to talk about a group of people who are witnesses. So again, this is what you have to do is go through and say, okay, now what does that of mean? The cloud of witnesses. Sometimes the word of course, means possession. If we're talking about the book of David, in other words, in English, we could say David's book, right? That's possession. But here, the word of does not mean possession, right? The word, if we say the preaching of Jesus Christ, then that could mean the preaching Jesus does, or the of could mean the preaching about Jesus that others are doing. And again, context would have to determine the meaning of the word of in those phrases. The same is here. Context has to determine what is the meaning of. And here, of is really functioning to identify this right here with that right there. The cloud is the witnesses. The witnesses are the cloud. And so we want to determine the syntax and proper translation of any phrase and make sure we understand cloud of witnesses, make sure we understand what does the phrase with endurance mean, make sure we understand what does the phrase for the joy set before him mean, and how these phrases are used in their clauses. All right, so this is the step of analyzing key phrases. Now, once you do that, guess what? Now you keep coming down the line. You're right, paragraph, sentence, clause, phrase, and what's next? Words. So now you move to the word level. And this is where you will do word studies of significant words in your text. Now, our text has some interesting words that we would probably want to do a word study on, right? For example, by the way, in this process, we want to note things like any repetition of words. Are there words that are repeated? Are there words that are synonyms? Are there words that are antonyms? All right? So we want to note things like that. So we want to do word studies. And in order to do word studies, you need certain tools. You need a lexicon. You got to have an English-Greek lexicon so you can do good word studies. You need a concordance so you can see how many times that word occurs in your book, but how many times does it occur in the New Testament. So you need a good concordance. Also, you need a good theological dictionary, like Colin Brown, the Dictionary of New Testament Theology is a good 3-volume dictionary. There are many other good ones, but you need a good theological dictionary to look up these words and see how they are used. Or you can use word study books that actually do word studies on key words in the New Testament. All of these are tools that you can use, all right, to do word studies. You got to have the right tools to do that. Now, watch things like, when you get ready to do word studies, look at things like repetition. Are there words that are repeated in my text? Look at things like words that are in the same domain semantically. In other words, are they synonyms? Or what about antonyms? Now, let's just do that. So, notice that in our text, the word endurance is repeated 3 times. Notice that it occurs in verse 1, verse 2, and verse 3. Therefore, this word's important to the author. So we make note of that. And this is a word, endurance is a word we would want to do a word study on. Well, the word endurance, that's a good translation, by the way, endurance. The word in Greek is the word hupomone, and it means to keep on keeping on, bearing under a load, meaning you don't quit. You don't stop, you don't quit, you endure. Now, this is the main concept that the author is combining with the word run the race. In order to succeed in running the race, you have to endure. You can't win the race if you don't endure. You can't run the race if you don't endure. And so obviously the author is saying endurance is a crucial part of this text. And then notice also the words in your text that mean the opposite of endurance. And there are 5. Waits, sin, entangles, grow weary, and lose heart. Notice those 5 things are the opposite of enduring. Do you see that? The author is saying, here's what you should do, and then this is what you don't do. Do this right there, endure. Don't do that right there. Do you see that? And this is why word studies become important. They help you to understand the meaning of your text. All right? So we're doing word studies now. All right? Now, once you do this, you are ready to go to the next step. You're ready to go to the step number 6. But before we move to step number 6, I want to pause and just see, are there any questions or comments that anybody here wants to make before we move on? Now, what we just did, step number 5, is the longest step of my 12-step process. Because basically that step is where you're doing all of your exegesis. You're doing all of your text analysis. You're doing everything you need to do in order to write a good sermon on this text that's accurate to its structure and to its meaning. And that's why that step, number 5, had all of those sub-steps. Start at the paragraph level, work your way down all the way to the word level. And I'm breaking that down for you to see how to do it. All right? Any other questions or comments about that? Okay. Well, hearing none, let's move to step number 6. This is my step of commentary work. Here is where you consult the commentaries. Now, you may have had to look up something in a commentary prior to this step. If you did, that's okay. But my point is, don't jump to the commentaries too quickly. You want to take the time that is needed to do all of the analysis with just you and your Bible, your Greek New Testament, if you have had Greek, and the Greek tools and other things. You want to do that work prior to running to the commentaries. Now, if you need commentaries to help you do step 5, no problem. You just go right ahead. No problem at all. But here now comes the step of actually consulting the commentaries. Now, this is a vital part. Commentaries are crucial to a pastor's toolbox and to preparing sermons. All of us use commentaries because the purpose of a commentary is to shed light on the text of Scripture. I've had the privilege of writing 2 or 3 commentaries. I've written one on Hebrews, written one on 1 John, and one on Job. And so I know the importance of commentaries. I use commentaries regularly in my preaching, just as you do. Now, let me point out to you that you want to use, I would say, at least 3 commentaries. Don't use less than that. Look at least 3 different commentaries on your text. And keep in mind that there are 3 kinds of commentaries, all right? Number 1, there are exegetical commentaries. These commentaries are considered the more technical commentaries. They deal with the Greek text, both in the body of the commentary and the footnotes. They're working from the Greek text and explaining to you the meaning of the Greek text. These commentaries are crucial if you've had Greek. They are less important if you've not had Greek. But I want to say this. Even though you may not have had Greek, you can benefit from these commentaries. You may not be able to understand the Greek that's there, but you can read everything they say about the Greek that is there. So these commentaries are actually helpful even if you have never studied Greek. So look, you've got the exegetical commentaries. These are the commentaries that look at the Greek text. Now, some of the series, let me just mention 1 or 2. The Baker Exegetical Commentary New Testament series, excellent. Baker Exegetical Commentary New Testament series is really good for that purpose. Here's another one, the Zondervan Exegetical Commentary on the New Testament. That series is a perfect series in this category. Now, both of those series lay out when they come to a section, they're not just doing verse by verse commentary. They are doing that, but they're going by paragraph and they're showing you the structure and outline of the paragraph and why that's true exegetically. So these kinds of commentaries are very helpful to you. All right. So you've got exegetical. Now there are other exegetical commentaries. I'm not naming them all, but you can look those up and become aware of what's out there. The second kind of commentary is sort of the bread and butter commentary. These are expository commentaries. These are the majority of commentaries, and they don't presume that you know Greek or Hebrew. They may refer to the Greek and Hebrew, but a lot of times they will transliterate it. They don't assume that you read Greek and Hebrew. So the expository commentaries are very important for all of us. These are commentaries that are going to basically tell you what this verse means, what this paragraph means. And expository commentaries vary as to how deep they go into that, but you would want to learn to use the really good expository commentaries. Let me give you some examples of those. The New American Commentary series is a good expository commentary series. I had the privilege of writing the volume on the book of Hebrews in that series. And so that's a very good series to use. The New American Commentary series. The Tyndale Old Testament commentaries and the Tyndale New Testament commentary series. Excellent expository commentaries. I would highly recommend them. The Expositor's Bible Commentary series. I believe there are 12 volumes on that cover all of the books of the New Testament. Several, like they put the Pentateuch together, and they might have 2 or 3 New Testament books that are together in one volume. But that series is excellent for preachers, and there are many others. There are so many more we could talk about. But the second category is the expository category. Now, there's a third category that you don't want to miss. That is what we call the devotional commentaries. Devotional commentaries are somewhat expository, but they're geared more toward warming your heart and for application. And the devotional commentaries are actually very important for preaching. And I have a lot of these in my library. They're not technically expository, or they're certainly not exegetical. They're somewhat expository, but their purpose is devotional, to feed your heart and to give application. And there's tons of good information that you need to get that would come for preaching out of a devotional commentary. People like F.B. Meyer, the great Baptist who was a contemporary of Charles Spurgeon there in England, F.B. Meyer's commentaries are devotionally oriented. They're very, very good. There are a number of commentaries that are a bit more devotionally oriented that are just so helpful for preaching. So you want to consult the commentaries. Well, before we go to number 7, let me pause there, see if anybody has a question or comment on this part of it. Commentary work. All right. Now, by the way, before we go to step number 7 here, I have done a little book. I produced a little book called Preaching Tools. And the book Preaching Tools is the subtitle of the book is an annotated survey of commentaries and resources for expository preaching on every book of the Bible. So it's arranged Genesis to Revelation. And so you go to Genesis, and there I list in these 3 categories, the exegetical category, I list the top 5 exegetical commentaries for you. And then the expository commentaries, I list the best there. And then the devotionals, I list the best for you there. And you will find that book very helpful to determine what commentaries to add to your library, what commentaries to use. Now, there are other commentary guides on the market that you can use. D.A. Carson has published a New Testament commentary survey. It's in about the 6th or 7th edition now. But anything and everything you want to know about commentaries on the New Testament, at least Carson's opinion about them, you can get in his book, A New Testament Commentary Survey. Douglas Stewart has done the same for the Old Testament. Old Testament Commentary Survey by Doug Stewart. I would add both of those volumes to my library if I were you. And whenever I'm getting ready to preach through a book of the Bible and I want to look at what I have in my library, what I may need to add, I'm going to look at those 2 resources to help me determine what I need to add to my commentaries. So learn the good commentaries, learn how to use the commentaries, learn how to use them for your benefit. They are indispensable when it comes to sermon preparation. All right, so that's a word about the commentaries. Now, let's go to step number 7 in my 12-step method. This is what I call the step of comparative translation work. Now, likely, you may not be doing this step in your own sermon prep. You might, but most books on sermon preparation don't talk much about this. Some do, but most don't. I am a big fan of doing comparative translation work. When I get to this point, and before I write my sermon, now that I've done the exegetical work, I want to say, okay, how do the key commentaries how do the key translations translate my text? And I want to look at the variation that's there. So not just the King James and the New King James, but what does the New American Standard Bible translate? How did that translate it? What about the ESV? What about the Christian Standard Bible? How did they translate it? What about the Net Bible? How do they translate it? And so I collect all these translations. Now, I've got a lot of them by print version, but of course, if you have access to a computer, you can get these translations digitally, and they're free, and you can do your comparative translation work on a computer. You can put on the same screen 5 at a time and just look at them. This step is actually very helpful for sermon preparation because it gives you ideas for the sermon, and particularly how to say the same thing but in different ways. How do I say that cloud of witnesses? How do I talk about that cloud of witnesses over there in Hebrews 12, 1 through 3? How do I talk about that with endurance phrase? Are there other ways that can be expressed to keep me from becoming monotonous in my sermon? It gives me variety. And that's the reason, a very important reason, for this particular step of doing comparative translation work. So look at how the different translations treat your text. Don't limit yourself to translations. I need to add that to this slide here. Also look at the paraphrases. Look at the paraphrases that are on the market today. For example, look at the paraphrase called The Message. What does Eugene Peterson have to say about my text? How does he translate my text? So I would look my text up in The Message, and I would get some ideas about how to use that language in preaching my text. I would look at these paraphrases. Don't be shy to look at a paraphrase. Let me give you an example out of Eugene Peterson that's really interesting. Take Psalm 1:1. Psalm 1:1. Blessed is the man who doesn't walk in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stand in the way of sinners, nor sit in the seat of the scoffers. Great verse. All right, a lot of word pictures there. Now, if you look at how Peterson translates that, he will say something. I don't have it in front of me, so don't hold me to this literally, but you can look it up. But he'll say something about happy is the guy who doesn't slink down dead-end road. That's pretty good. I like that. Or happy is the guy who doesn't hang out at Sin's Saloon. Or he'll say, happy is the guy who doesn't attend Smart Mouth College. Now, obviously, those are paraphrases expressed in a colloquial English way, using idioms and using word pictures the way we use in the English language. Everybody, or at least most people, are aware of the phrase smart mouth college. Somebody who's a smart mouth, and we say, well, he attended Smart Mouth College. He's a smart mouth, he's a cynical person or whatever. See, that helps you in your preaching because that allows you, learning that from Peterson allows you to preach Psalm 1, verse 1, and gives you ways of expressing that in modern day English that help to communicate the point that the author is making. So do comparative translation work. Look at the various translations that are there and the paraphrases. Let that help you prepare your sermon, because I get all kinds of good ideas when I do that. When I compare translations, I get all kind of really good ideas. Some translations will treat a particular phrase and they will disambiguate that phrase. In other words, that phrase may be a little bit ambiguous in the English translation, but they will tell you exactly what that phrase means by the way they render it, and it helps you to see the meaning. Let me give you an example of that. Take 1 John 2, verse 15. Don't love the world, neither the things that are in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Now let's look at that phrase, the love of the Father. Now let me ask you, what does that phrase mean, the love of the Father? Well, that phrase can mean two things, can mean one of two things. It can either mean the love of the Father for you, or it can mean your love of the Father. You see, the word of there is ambiguous, because the phrase alone, the love of the Father, can be interpreted in one of two ways. The Father's love for you or your love for the Father. Now notice those are exact opposites. So now the question is, well, how do we determine what that phrase means? Well, the first answer to that is context. Usually, the context will disambiguate the meaning. So, the love of the Father, in the context of 1 John 2:15. Go back and listen to it this way. Don't love the world. Who is John commanding not to love the world? You. Don't love anything in the world. Who is told not to love the world? You. If anyone loves the world, who's doing the loving there? Anyone. The love of the Father is not in him. Now, John has established you as the subject of the loving. Therefore, contextually, that continues through. So, if you love the world, you can't be loving God. Do you see? That's what John is saying. If you love the world, then you can't love God at the same time. Now, if you look at 5 different translations, 1 or 2 of those 5 will translate that instead of literally the love of the Father, they will translate it, you can't love the Father. In other words, they will disambiguate the meaning of the word of in that phrase. That's the value of doing comparative translation work. It helps you to see more clearly what the author is saying. So instead of looking at one main translation, look at several in your sermon process. All right, let's get one more under our belt here. Number 8, step number 8 of my 12 steps. Now, at this point, you are ready to determine the central idea of your text. What we used to call in homiletics classes the CIT, the central idea of the text. Now, what is the main point of Hebrews 12, 1 and 2? What is the central idea of that text? Well, the answer to that question is found in the single independent clause, independent sentence. That's the imperative. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. The author is using the long-distance race as a metaphor for enduring in the Christian life. That is the central idea. Now, how do we know that's the central idea? Lots of other ideas are stated in the text. We have a great cloud of witnesses. We lay aside weights and the sin. We keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. Jesus is the one who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, etc. So how do we know of all of the ideas that are stated in the text, which one is the central idea? And the way we know that is through the linguistics or through the grammar of the fact that there's one independent clause and it's an imperative. And that imperative dominates that paragraph. That imperative drives that paragraph. Therefore, your central idea of that text, you can word it however you want to, but your central idea is the notion of enduring in the Christian life, living the Christian life with endurance. That's the point of your text. That's the main point of your text. So once you determine that, guess what? At that point, you are ready to move toward outlining your text and writing your sermon. There's the main point you're trying to communicate. Everything in the sermon, right, the spokes of the sermon are all going to emanate from that hub right there, the central idea of that text. That's a crucial step number 8. But see, you're prepared for that step now because you've done all the exegetical work you need to do to get to this point to identify that. So you identify that, and then, as we're going to see in our next time together, our next lesson, now you're ready to move toward the actual writing of your sermon because you've got all the data that you need now. So you're ready to write it after that. Step number 8, determine the central idea. What's the main point of the text? And that is crucial. Okay, let me pause and see if we have any questions or any final comments before we close up shop here for this lesson today. Anybody? All minds clear out there?
All sounds good.
All right.
Excited.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us in this lesson. This has been lesson number 4. And so we'll just pick right up here, lesson number 5. We'll pick up with step number 9. And this next lesson we'll be able to finish the 12 steps and move on from there. So thank you for being with us today. God bless you. And remember, next Sunday, preach the word.